Thank you, everybody, for coming. Can you guys hear me okay? I want to particularly thank Amanda, Aman, Amrit, all the students for their efforts to make this happen. It's very clear that it was not easy, but this is really an important conversation. It's important because I think one of the defining characteristics, not only of the drone campaign, but really the war on terror in general, has been the extent to which it's been shrouded in secrecy and waged in the shadows. And conversations like this, I think, are critical, to shine light on the program and really to push us to reflect on the larger questions. I have the good fortune of following Mary Ellen, so she provided, I think, a really comprehensive look at some of the legal issues, and to be followed by really distinguished panelists who are going to talk a lot about the larger questions that have to do with the topic of this panel. So I really want to focus on the specific topic of the civilian consequences of drone strikes, some of the topics that were covered in the video we began the presentation with. Because all too often, I think the conversation about drone strikes focuses on either the question of, whether it's a militant, between quotes, or civilian that's killed, or in more strategic questions. Questions like, is the intel good? Are drones effective? Is there blowback? What are the geopolitical implications? But there really isn't a lot of discussion about the effects on communities that have the misfortune of living underneath drones. So I wanted to spend my 15 minutes. I know it's a tall order, so I'm going to really focus on Pakistan, because that's the area I've done the most field work. I've done some in Yemen as well, and I think some in this room are familiar with the report that the Open Society Institute put out last week on Yemen, which really, I think, seconded a lot of the findings in the research we undertook back in 2012. I just want to clarify from the outset that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not either as a representative of Stanford, NYU, or the Center for Constitutional Rights. I want to start with just a little bit of methodology in terms of how we went about doing this research. I think it's very important given the limitations and the secrecy that has been discussed on the panel. A clinical team, both from NYU, from the Global Justice Clinic, and from Stanford's International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic, undertook 2 field missions to Pakistan. Those missions included faculty and students, and we conducted 130 interviews with a range of stakeholders, including 69 individuals who live in communities where drones operate, many of whom survived drone strikes, others of whom lost family members in drone strikes. And really the backdrop for our research, as was indicated in the video, was this pronouncement by John Brennan that many remember, who's now head of the CIA, that there are no civilian casualties in drone strikes. And this idea of a surgically precise tool that suddenly made the resort to warfare easier. So we really wanted to interrogate sort of that thesis, which really was the prevalent narrative around drones around the time of 2010, 2011, when their use was multiplying. So because the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan, the area in which the drone strikes have taken place in Pakistan, is virtually sealed off. It's very difficult not only for internationals, but even for Pakistanis who are not from the tribal areas to enter or exited. We actually weren't able to enter that area to do field work as you typically do in a human rights investigation. Instead, we actually arranged for communities and individuals to meet us outside of Pakistan. We were able to make contact with these communities through a range of sources, including Pakistani NGOs, including journalists, including tribal leaders and others. Of course, it was a limited sample size, as tends to be the case when you investigate human rights issues. In particular, the research didn't include a significant number of women, because given cultural factors there, it's not easy for them to travel, but we were still able to interview, again, 69 folks that live in those communities, a range of others, review physical evidence and secondary sources. So I want to really focus on 2, I think, general kind of categories of findings that came out of that research. In the first, and I should also mention, of course, that in addition to the limitations on going to the tribal areas, we also had the limited transparency around sort of the legal rationale and framework of the Obama and Bush administrations, as well as the fact that we weren't able to get a wider sample of physical evidence outside of what people were able to bring to us. So I think the first thing I want to focus on is the reality that our report and others have shown, and that has been talked about, that drones do kill and maim civilians, and not just militants, between quotes. And there are a number of reasons, I think, why this narrative has not been well understood. I think it's started to be broken through in the last 3-4 months. But let me start with terminology. The term militant, again, I use it between quotes, is a legally meaningless term. It's never defined what it actually means, and you will not find any international law treatise that talks about, what a militant is. Right to kill them, exactly. And I think it doesn't distinguish between, even if you were to take the term militant, that term as used often by news reports or anonymous government officials doesn't distinguish by even high-level versus low-level militant, even if you were to accept this legally meaningless term. And as was mentioned in the introduction, the New York Times investigative piece pointed out that the way in which this administration has been calculating militants has been to presume after the fact that any male that's sort of between teenage age and about 65 is a militant, except if evidence after the fact indicates they were civilians. But of course, we know there isn't ever post facto investigations. So I think just to start off with, the reason why I think the narrative has been sort of misunderstood is the terminology. The second is frankly sourcing. And this doesn't just apply to the way the government calculates casualties, but even the prominent data aggregators like the New America Foundation, like the Long War Journal, that too often rely on anonymous government officials. Because frequently what happens is journalists don't have contacts on the ground in the tribal areas. At most, they may have a stringer. In many cases, those stringers face a lot of pressure, aren't able to access all parts of the tribal areas, face pressure from the Pakistani government, from terrorist organizations, from many other sources. So the journalist will rely on a statement they get from Pakistani or U.S. intelligence that will tell them we killed 15 militants. And there never is any effort to sort of interrogate whether or not that statement is valid. In fact, we did a study of the New America Foundation's data set around drone strikes, and we found 88% of the time the news articles they cited in their information quoted as their only source an anonymous government official. The next thing I want to point out is that, and I mentioned this before, is that there's absolutely no post facto investigations or updating of the statistics. At the end of the day, we found the most accurate data aggregator to be the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is what we cited up there, and I can get into Q&A a little bit more about methodology, but I just wanted to lay out the statistics as of today around drone strikes, which Mary Ellen also mentioned in her presentation. In Pakistan alone, and I think we have much better data on Pakistan than we do for various reasons on Yemen and anywhere, there have been 415 drone strikes, 364 under President Obama, of which there have been, again, according to the most conservative numbers that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which again, we believe based on our research undercounts the actual amount of deaths, because they, at the end of the day, do have to rely on journalist sources. And I'll just give one example from our research. We interviewed 15 individuals that told us about a particular drone strike, but we actually weren't able, because we couldn't go to the area, review the physical evidence to conclusively determine that it was a drone strike. No journalist source had said it was, and just the testimonies alone weren't enough for us to count it as a drone strike. That's not included in any data aggregation source, even though the testimonies we received about what the plane looked like, the way it operated, when it flew, etc., fit the profile of a drone strike. So just to give you that perspective. Of that, there have been between 2,449 and 3,949 people killed in Pakistan alone, of which, according to their data, between 421 and 960 are civilians, and between 172 and 207 are children. Again, Pakistan alone, and of course, if you add up Yemen, Somalia, and all the Afghanistan, all the other places where drones have operated, we're talking about many dozen more strikes. And in the report, which I won't go into in depth, we profiled 3 drone strikes in which we actually spoke to a number of eyewitnesses and survivors of the strike, and really showed that civilians were indeed killed, and the sort of statements made by U.S. officials about civilians not being killed were simply not accurate. But what I really want to focus on for the remainder of my time is really the psychological and social impacts that drones have on communities in Pakistan, and has been shown by other research in Yemen as well. As the video indicated, drones do not just fire. They're not a tool that just kind of goes into an area, strikes, and goes away. In many parts of Pakistan, they regularly surveil communities. In parts of the country, they fly overhead 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often in packs of 4 and 5. And interviewees that I spoke with and that our research team spoke with highlighted how terrifying their presence was. I mean, I really encourage everybody to just kind of imagine you have the misfortune of living in a community in which drones operate, in which you have a perpetual reminder flying overhead of imminent death, because drone strikes can be random. There isn't, even we as analysts and scholars can't tell you that there's a discernible sort of pattern in which drones operate and strike, particularly given the increasing practice of signature strikes, which, for those that are not familiar, are strikes that actually are not based on looking for a particular individual, but rather are based on patterns of behavior. So in a sense, racial profiling on steroids, right, used as a tool for killing. And folks that live below them are constantly reminded that at any moment they could die, and they're powerless to control their own fate. And it's reinforced by that continual presence. One drone strike survivor who lost both legs told us, quote, "Everyone is scared all the time. When we're sitting together to have a meeting, we're scared there may be a strike. When you can hear the drone circling in the sky, you think it might strike you. We're always scared. We always have this fear in our heads. A taxi driver that we spoke with told us, "We are always thinking that it's either going to attack our homes or whatever we do. It's going to strike us. It's going to attack us. No matter what we're doing, that fear is always inculcated in us. Because whether we are driving a car, or we're working on a farm, or we're sitting home playing cards, no matter what we're doing, we're always thinking that the drone will strike us. We are scared to do anything, no matter what." You can imagine that effect pervades every aspect of life in the federally administered tribal areas and manifests itself in several different ways. One of the ways it manifests itself is in the medical effects. We consulted with health practitioners, doctors, and others that actually treated folks that lived in the federally administered tribal areas. And we also reviewed our transcripts with doctors at Stanford and NYU who told us that these folks we spoke with displayed symptomatoms emblematic of PTSD, of anxiety. They included things like emotional breakdowns, running in fear, hiding, feigning nightmares, invasive thoughts, being hyper startled, reactions to loud noises, outbursts of anger and irritability, loss of appetite, and sometimes even physical ailments, aches, pains, rashes, itches, and bloody noses that are indicative of having high levels of PTSD or anxiety. With children, we had a lot of people tell us about the difficulties children have sleeping, of sort of coping, because their drones are sort of always in their conscious and on their mind. And of course, these medical problems are complicated by the fact that we're talking about a very poor area. We're talking about an area in which there's very weak health infrastructure. There's a lack of awareness about mental illness, and there is that those that have mental illness are stigmatized and is sort of seen as being not having a medical ailment, but being sort of crazy, for lack of a better word. The second effect that perpetual terror has on communities is really affecting everyday life. Schools have been attacked. Schools have been attacked because you can imagine, especially with signature strikes, if you're looking for patterns of behavior that may raise eyebrows, young men gathered in groups tend to be something that would raise alert. And schools have been attacked, and children have been killed. And it's led many parents to admit to us, and they were ashamed to do so, that they were forced to withdraw their children from school because they didn't want to risk their children being a victim of a drone strike. In fact, and let's remember that the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan has a literacy rate of about 17%. So we're talking about an area in which schooling is incredibly important. And of course, with hundreds and more folks being killed, we're having children entering the workforce younger and younger to face the difficulties that families, many of whom live with extended families, face dealing with those realities. Also, as again you saw in the video, we have documented strikes on first responders and on rescuers. And when we spoke with folks, it was a matter of common knowledge that when people hear drone strike, their first instinct is to wait 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, to make sure there isn't a double tap secondary strike before going in to rescue those that may be injured, to check on family members. So just imagine that situation, knowing somebody is under the rubble and being injured, but not wanting to sort of go in there because you're afraid of a secondary follow-up strike. And really the effect, the major effect that I want to take home to you is that effect on everyday social and cultural life. The fear of gathering in groups, the fear of, for example, getting together with larger family, of going to the market. For many, there's even a fear of convening in jirgas. And jirga in northwest Pakistan is an institution traditionally used to resolve disputes. But again, you bring together 40, 45 elders in a community, and the risk that one or both of them may have gotten the attention of a drone is heightened to the point where this important social institution isn't regularly convening. And we've seen similar things with funerals, because as we document in the report, there have been instances in which the United States has killed a particular individual in a drone strike, only for the purpose of having that person's cousin, who they believe to be a militant, show up at the funeral and then target that individual. So practices like that, and we've had weddings that have been struck in Pakistan, as has been documented by Human Rights Watch and other groups. So again, you see these sorts of patterns affecting the very fabric of community life. The president of the Tribal Union of Journalists in the region told us, quote, "If I'm walking in the market, I have this fear that maybe the person walking next to me is going to be a target of the drone. If I'm shopping, I'm really careful and scared. If I'm standing on a road and there's a car parked next to me, I never know if that's going to be the target. Maybe they'll target the car in front of me or behind me. Even in mosques, even if we're praying, we're worried that maybe one person who's standing with us praying is wanted. So wherever we are, we have this fear of drones." Two other consequences, and then I'll wrap up with the two kind of larger thoughts before I turn it over, which is the economic effects. Not only the economic effects because, if you're tending to kill young men, you can imagine a lot of families losing breadwinners and the effect that has on families' economic status. But that's in addition to many industries, mining, etc., that have been undermined by the perpetual drone strikes on particular areas. And the last effect I want to talk about, and again, we can talk more about this in Q&A, is the breakdown of trust within a community that you see hinted at in some of the statements I've read to you, because you're always worried that the person to your left or to your right may be an informant or maybe a target. And what does that mean for a community? What does it mean for a fabric of a community if you're always leading, if you're always having suspicion? It really breaks down civil society at a fundamental level. So really, I want to conclude with two sort of thoughts to leave you with, and hopefully we can talk about more in Q&A. And the first has to go back to, is to relate to the legal questions that Mary Ellen raised. Quite simply, there's been an incoherence, and I think the fact that her forthcoming article mentions 8 different legal theories that have sort of been thrown out should give you a sense that there is a lack of coherence. There's a lack of any sort of explanation of under what legal basis this administration is arguing, and the jumbled nature of this rationale, the fact there's been no coherent articulation of the legal basis for strikes or the identity of who's been killed, leaves, not to mention, which again is critically important because too often as human rights groups there's a focus on transparency, the substantive questions that Mary Ellen and others have raised, and about the really the underpinnings of the legal framework for drone strikes. So I really hope we can talk more about that. And the second larger question I think to ponder going forward is really the fact that drones make not only sanitize war, right, in a way that removes the cost. They're low cost, no risk, no checks. It's far away. We use terminology like Reaper drones, like bug splat, which is a term of art used for the consequences of a drone strike, without really stopping to ponder what that means about war. But I think more fundamentally, what does it mean about the fact that the recourse to force has become so much easier? What does it mean that to the rule of law that there is no public accounting for what's taking place? And what does it mean that the programs are so rarely challenged or discussed? What does it mean that a group of students that decides to have a conversation like this comes under such scrutiny by faculty and administration? I think these are all questions for us to ponder. Thank you.